John adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never quite shaken. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn of the old Victorian house, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. He was showing the property to a young couple, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The house sat on a lonely hill overlooking miles of cornfields, a quintessential Ohio landscape. As they stepped through the creaking front door, a sudden, cloying odor assaulted their nostrils. It was a sickeningly sweet smell, like rotting meat mixed with a hint of sulfur. John grimaced, glancing at the couple. They exchanged uneasy glances, wrinkling their noses. Just as quickly as it appeared, the stench vanished, leaving behind only the musty smell of old wood and dust. The couple politely excused themselves, citing the need to discuss things further. John watched their car disappear down the long driveway, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. It was just the house, he told himself, old and neglected. But the smell, it had been so real, so visceral. The couple's hasty departure left John alone with the unsettling silence of the house. He decided to do some digging. Back at his office, he pulled up the property records. The house had been built in the late 1800s and had remained in the Blackwood family for generations. Local law, gleaned from a few quick online searches, painted a grim picture. Silas Blackwood, a name that surfaced repeatedly, was rumored to have dabbled in the occult. Stories circulated about strange rituals performed on the property, whispers of animal sacrifices, and then Silas's sudden disappearance. No body was ever found. The thought sent a shiver down John's spine. He returned to the house the next day, armed with a flashlight. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the grimy windows. The air was thick and still, the only sound the whisper of wind through broken panes. He explored the main floor, the rooms filled with decaying furniture draped in white sheets like ghostly figures. Descending into the dark, damp basement, the air grew colder. Then it returned. The stench. It was faint, but undeniably there, clinging to the damp stone walls. John quickly retreated, a growing sense of dread settling over him. The following weekend, John's daughter Sarah came to stay. She was a bright, inquisitive 8-year-old, and John cherished their time together. He tried to put the unsettling events at the house out of his mind, focusing on making her weekend enjoyable. However, as they were packing her things to leave on Sunday evening, Sarah paused, a small frown creasing her brow. "Daddy," she said, her voice small. "When I came here to get my doll last week, there was a really bad smell at that house, like your rotten eggs and yucky meat." John's heart sank. He had briefly brought her to the Victorian house to retrieve a forgotten toy, thinking nothing of it. He knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's just an old house, sweetie," he said, forcing a smile. "Old houses sometimes have funny smells." Sarah didn't look convinced. "It was scary," she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit. John pulled her into a hug, a wave of guilt washing over him. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from anything that could cause her harm. But the unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach told him that something was very wrong. John couldn't shake Sarah's words. The image of her small, worried face haunted him. He found himself drawn back to the Victorian house, a morbid curiosity pulling him in. He started spending more time there, ostensibly to prepare it for future showings, but in reality, he was searching for an explanation for the smell, for the unease that permeated the place. As the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. It began subtly, a faint whisper just at the edge of hearing, a fleeting shadow in the corner of his eye. He would whirl around, expecting to see someone, but there was never anything there. Then objects began to move. A book would be displaced on a shelf, a chair slightly turned from its original position. The smell, once intermittent, became more frequent, lingering in the air like a shroud. It was always accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature, a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. One evening, while working late, John heard a distinct whisper close to his ear, seemingly coming from within the walls themselves. It was unintelligible, a low, guttural murmur, but it sent a jolt of fear through him. He began researching Silas Blackwood more intensely, discovering online forums and local historical societies that discussed the man and the strange events surrounding his life and disappearance. Tales of missing livestock and even whispers of vanished locals during Blackwood's time began to surface, painting a darker picture than the initial rumors. Driven by a growing sense of dread, John decided to delve deeper into the local archives. He visited the small town's library, a quiet, dusty building filled with the scent of old paper. The librarian, a kind, elderly woman named Mrs. Davison, directed him to a section dedicated to local history. There, amongst faded photographs and yellowed documents, he found what he was looking for: old newspaper clippings detailing the life and times of Silas Blackwood. The articles painted a portrait of a reclusive man, obsessed with ancient texts and arcane practices. One article, dated 1888, described a series of strange occurrences on the Blackwood property: livestock found mutilated, strange symbols carved into trees, and unsettling reports of chanting echoing through the woods at night. The article concluded with the mysterious disappearance of Silas himself, leaving behind only rumors of a pact made with some dark entity. John's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling that no one would believe him if he told them what he was experiencing. He had stopped talking about the house to his friends and colleagues, their initial curiosity quickly turning to concern and then to a subtle distancing. They saw him as becoming obsessed, consumed by the old house and its history. He started having vivid nightmares, filled with shadowy figures lurking in the darkness and the ever-present nauseating stench. The line between reality and nightmare was beginning to blur. The newspaper articles mentioned a small, abandoned cemetery located near the Blackwood property. John decided to visit it. The cemetery was overgrown with weeds and vines. The tombstones, tilted at precarious angles, as if struggling to stay upright. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As he wandered through the rows of forgotten graves, a sense of unease settled over him. He finally found it, the Blackwood family plot. Several weathered stones marked the resting places of generations of Blackwoods. And then he saw it, the grave of Silas Blackwood. The tombstone was cracked and covered in moss, almost illegible. But as John got closer, he noticed something etched into the stone, just below the barely visible name. A strange symbol, a series of interconnected lines and circles. The stench was almost unbearable here, the strongest he had yet encountered. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating. John took a picture of the symbol with his phone, his hand trembling. He quickly left the cemetery, feeling as though he were being watched. Back at home, he researched the symbol online. It was an ancient sigil used in summoning rituals, a symbol meant to open a gateway to something. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He was no longer dealing with just a strange smell or unexplained noises. He was facing something far more sinister, something that had been deliberately invoked. The weight of his discovery pressed heavily on John. He barely slept, plagued by nightmares of the sigil and the suffocating stench. He tried to avoid thinking about it, but the image of the symbol was burned into his mind. One night his phone rang, jolting him awake. It was Sarah. Her voice was trembling, thick with tears. "Daddy," she sobbed, "I had a bad dream, a really bad dream." John's heart pounded in his chest. "What is it, sweetie?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. I saw..." "That house," she stammered. "It was dark and there was a scary man there. He was all shadows and he smelled like that bad smell from before." John's blood ran cold. "And he kept saying your name, Daddy," Sarah continued, her voice barely a whisper. "He kept whispering, 'John, John.'" John felt a wave of terror wash over him. He tried to reassure Sarah, telling her it was just a dream, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew deep down that it was more than that. He knew that whatever was in that house, whatever he had stumbled upon, was now reaching out, touching his daughter. The thought filled him with a primal fear, a desperate need to protect her. He felt a surge of anger directed at himself for ever getting involved with that place, for putting Sarah in danger. He promised her he would make sure everything was all right, but as he hung up the phone, he knew he had to confront whatever was lurking in the Blackwood house, not just for himself, but for Sarah. Driven by a mixture of fear and a fierce protectiveness towards Sarah, John returned to the Victorian house. This time, he wasn't searching for answers. He was preparing for a confrontation. He carried a heavy flashlight and a small silver crucifix that had belonged to his grandmother. He had never been a particularly religious man, but in this moment of desperation, he clung to any semblance of hope. The house was eerily silent, the usual whispers and creaks absent. The air, however, was thick with the now familiar stench, so potent it made his eyes water. He made his way down to the basement, the cold dampness seeping through his clothes. He noticed a section of the wall that seemed slightly different, a subtle discoloration in the stone. Upon closer inspection, he found a loose brick. He pulled it out, revealing a narrow opening. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, revealing a small, hidden room. The stench was overwhelming here, almost unbearable. The air was heavy, stagnant, and the temperature had plummeted, sending shivers down his spine. In the center of the room stood a crude stone altar, covered in dust and grime. Carved into its surface were symbols identical to the one on Silas, Blackwood's tombstone. As John stared at the altar, a sudden gust of icy air swept through the room, extinguishing his flashlight. He fumbled for his lighter, his hands shaking. The small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, a dark shape began to coalesce, forming a vaguely humanoid figure. It wasn't a solid form, but rather a shifting mass of shadows, constantly swirling and reforming. The stench intensified, becoming almost physically painful, a putrid mix of decay and sulfur that burned his nostrils. An oppressive sense of malice filled the room, a palpable feeling of pure evil. The shadowy figure in the corner of the room began to stir, the swirling mass of darkness slowly taking on a more defined shape. It didn't have a face, but John could feel its gaze, a cold, empty stare that seemed to pierce through him. A low, guttural growl emanated from the figure, a sound that resonated deep within his chest, vibrating his very bones. Then, a voice, not spoken aloud but rather projected, directly into his mind, echoed through the room. It was a voice of immense age and power, laced with malice and despair. "Silas, you promised a vessel." The voice rasped, the words forming in John's mind like shards of broken glass. He understood then. Silas Blackwood hadn't simply disappeared. He had made a pact, offering himself as a vessel for this entity in exchange for something. Power? Knowledge? John didn't know, and at that moment he didn't care. The entity was now looking for a new host, and John realized with chilling certainty that he was the intended recipient. The entity began to advance, the stench, growing stronger with each step, causing John's stomach to churn. It reached out a shadowy hand, and John felt a cold, clammy touch on his arm, sending a jolt of pure terror through him. The entity began to probe his mind, sifting through his memories, his fears, his deepest insecurities. It latched onto his guilt over his divorce, his fear of being a bad father to Sarah. Weak, alone, afraid, the voice whispered, feeding on his vulnerabilities. Just then his phone rang. It was Sarah. In a moment of sheer panic, John yelled into the phone, "Sarah, stay away from the house. Don't come here." The line went dead. He looked back at the entity, and he saw a flicker of something in its shadowy form, a flicker of satisfaction. It was feeding on his fear, on his desperation to protect his daughter. In that moment, something inside John snapped. He was no longer just afraid. He was enraged. He clutched the crucifix in his hand, holding it out towards the entity. The sight of the crucifix seemed to have a physical effect on the entity. The shadowy form recoiled, hissing like escaping steam. The oppressive cold lessened slightly, and the stench, while still present, became less intense. John felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate surge of hope. He held the crucifix tighter, his knuckles white. He didn't understand why it was working, but he wasn't about to question it. He backed away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the entity. It remained in the corner, its shadowy form flickering and distorting, as if struggling to maintain its presence. John continued to retreat, moving towards the basement stairs. He stumbled as he reached the first step, nearly falling. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not stopping until he burst out of the house and into the cool night air. He gasped for breath, his lungs burning. As he moved further from the house, he noticed something. The stench was fading. By the time he reached the end of the driveway, it was almost gone. He looked back at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the starry sky. It seemed strangely silent, almost peaceful. Then he saw headlights approaching. It was Sarah's mother, Lisa, her face etched with worry. Sarah was in the passenger seat, her eyes wide with fear. She jumped out of the car and ran to John, throwing her arms around him. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, relief washing over him in waves. The house remained, silent and still on the hill, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. The local authorities were contacted, but a search of the house revealed nothing unusual. The hidden room in the basement was dismissed as an old storage space. The house remained unsold, a silent sentinel overlooking the cornfields. John and Sarah moved into a small apartment in town. It was nothing fancy, but it was safe, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the old Victorian house. John started seeing a therapist, trying to process the events he had experienced. He recounted the strange occurrences, the whispers, the shadows, the overwhelming stench. The therapist listened patiently, offering words of comfort and suggesting coping mechanisms for dealing with the trauma. But John knew that no amount of therapy could erase what he had seen, what he had felt. The entity, the darkness he had encountered in that hidden room, had left a mark on him, a deep, invisible scar. Although the stench no longer permeated the air around the house, John still caught whiffs of it occasionally, a phantom smell that would suddenly appear, triggering a wave of nausea and fear. It would happen at the most unexpected times, while grocery shopping, driving in his car, even while playing with Sarah. He would freeze, his senses heightened, searching for the source of the smell, knowing deep down that it wasn't real, that it was a memory, a lingering echo of the horror he had faced. The house on the hill remained empty, a silent reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the ordinary. Some said the land was cursed, others dismissed it as local folklore. But John knew the truth. He knew that something had been awakened there, something ancient and malevolent, and although he had managed to escape, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere, waiting. Or perhaps a more chilling thought occurred to him. Perhaps it had never truly left.